Monarchy. Upon hearing this word, many images come to mind. A figure cloaked in velvet and adorned with gold, seated atop a throne, a jeweled staff in hand. Behind him, a mountain of gold, unearned, inherited. Outside his palace, a famine-stricken populace, hollow-eyed and ragged, their bones barely holding them together as the king feasts in his private kitchen. Before him are nobles, peasants, clergy, all bowing, not chained by iron, but by tyranny itself. This, we are told, is monarchy, the ruthless absolutist regime, a system born to exploit, a system rightfully left behind in favor of our enlightened modern-day liberal democracy. Oh, the horror! We should be glad to have moved away from this relic from the past to our brand new system, liberal democratic republicanism, away from that despotic relic of the past, that evil system that exploited man for millennia. Or did it? Greetings and salutations, I am Erosian, and today we'll be doing a follow-up on my video of Whig history. This video will explore monarchy itself, since the Enlightenment and Whig historians have portrayed monarchy as a tyrannical relic, an obstacle to progress, reason, and liberty. This portrayal is not only incorrect but deeply harmful for understanding of monarchy in both the historical and political sense. It served to poison the well, casting kings and queens as villains so that liberal democracy can be hailed as the sole path to freedom. But history is rarely that simple. Monarchy is not always, or even not often at all, what Enlightenment propagandists claimed it to be. So what is monarchy really, and how do liberal thinkers deliberately distort the image as history has marched forward? We begin in Greece. There were many radical experiments to monarchism in this period. Sparta had two kings. Macedonia was a theocratic monarchy, blend of divine right with militaristic Hellenist tradition, foreshadowing the god kings of Alexander's successors. And Athens would eventually abolish the monarchy and establish a democratic republic. Athens overthrew their monarchy after a long period of political struggle. The overthrowing of the king was seen as an example for Enlightenment thinkers to base themselves off of. They saw it as naturally progressing from the past of monarchism to the future of democracy, with people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau saying, "The laws of Athens were made free for the people. They still serve as a model for all free nations." To understand how Enlightenment thinkers misrepresent the classical era, we must understand the first criticism of monarchy. The Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle will be the focus of this section, as they both talk about monarchy and democracy as a system of government in their works. Aristotle, despite having very positive views on monarchy, seeing it as a system that can bring great change, under the right hands, would even be the best form of government. He would say this in his book Politics: "When one man is superior in virtue, it is just that he should be the sole ruler. Such a man may even be truly called a god amongst men." He also said that it could devolve into one of the worst governments, that being a tyranny. As stated in his book Politics yet again, and I quote, "Kingship changes into tyranny, for tyranny is a wicked perversion of monarchy, for kingship is the government of one according to law, having a regard for the common interest. However, tyranny is the government of one according to his own interest." Often, Athenian democracy is idealized in the modern era as a timeless model for governance. Enlightenment thinkers certainly share this view, holding Athens to be the beacon of liberty, quoting ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle to push their own free democratic society. As stated prior, they saw Athens as an example of progression from the past to the future, yet such portrayals are, of course, rose-tinted romanticisms and selective memory. In reality, Athenian democracy was achieved through corruption, not a natural chain of progress. You had wealthy men and nobles that had no real power over the king. So what happened is you have these wealthy merchants and noble classes curtailing power away from the king to making his role more ceremonial, as well as starting propaganda campaigns, like the mythic Last King of Cordis, where they made it seem like no king could ever replace him. So wealthy merchants did what they did best, and they manipulated the populace into getting them to support ideas of republicanism. Athenian democracy also became highly exclusive. Only wealthy, landowning men could vote. Women were barred from political life, as they were considered too emotional. In early periods, even certain men, such as homosexuals, were excluded on grounds that they were hysterical. Far from the harmonious public forum, Athenian democracy was a fertile ground for demagogues, where eloquence and populist pandering often triumphed over sound governance. Plato himself, often a recast of Enlightenment thinkers as a champion of democracy, openly critiqued it. In his Gorgias, he likened democracy to a trial where reason loses to flattery. He says, "Imagine, if you will, a trial between a doctor and a cook, before a jury of children. The doctor will accuse the cook of feeding them sweets and pastries, and ruining their health, while he prescribes them bitter draughts in a strict diet. Do you suppose the doctor would be able to persuade them? Not in the least. The cook would win every time." This was no mere throwaway line. For Plato, the cook represents the demagogue indulging the people's appetites while leading them to ruin. Aristotle's view was no less critical. While he acknowledged that democracy's theoretical grounding in equality, he also warned that it easily devolves into a rule of the poor majority at the expense of the wealthy minority. In his book, Politics, he says, democracy rises out of the notion that those who are equal in any respect are absolutely equal. All are alike free, therefore they claim that they are free absolutely. And the result is that the poor govern and the rich are oppressed. These perspectives remind us that the classical era's most celebrated thinkers did not see democracy as an unqualified good, a fact often obscured by later idealization. I will be going further into their beliefs on democracy in a later video, but all you need to know for now is that Athenian democracy was ruled by demagogues, and often elections were irrational and unequal on the populace. This will be the first lie we will be addressing, and more to come. The next big lie during this period is when Rome deposed their king for severely morally disturbing actions and incompetence of ruling, at least according to Roman tradition. The heir of the kingdom of Rome raped Lucretia, a young noblewoman of a powerful family in respect, the family of Lucretii Tripitinis. This caused massive outrage in both the public and the nobility, considering the king was well liked due to his cool and oppressive reign and inability to govern effectively. His own generals turned on him. Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius' grieving husband, Lucius Tarquinius Galatinius, himself related to the royal family, joined the revolt out of the outrage and a sense of honor. They stormed the palace and expelled him from the kingdom, an event that can be summarized by Cicero as, "The people had convinced a hatred of the kingly name itself as a result of the arrogance of Tarquin, and they preferred to be ruled by annual magistrates rather than by perpetual sovereignty." Despite what that quote may have you to believe, and what later thinkers forgot, is that Rome's hatred was not of the monarchy itself, but of Tarquin's corruption of it. The kings before him, like Numa, Servius Tullius, were remembered fondly. The Republic was not born as an abstraction and rejection of monarchy, but from a concrete rejection of one man's abuse of it, which ironically ties back to what Aristotle said about how a monarchy can turn into a tyranny. Brutus, after disposing of the king, noted himself that there was no real contest to power, as the king and the royal line were out of the picture, and seeing that everyone wasn't really keen on reinstalling the monarchy, he took power for himself. However, given the nobility's distrust of authority, because of the man before him, decided to install his right-hand man in power as well, to prevent one man from taking all the power and potentially installing another tyranny, that man being Lucius Tarquinius Galatius. He was the second consul. Upon the establishment of the Republic, Brutus was alleged to give a speech, which I'll summarize using Livy's retelling. Brutus, holding a bloody knife, told Tarquin and his accursed brood should be driven out, with fire and sword and whatever else of war was at their disposal, and that they should never be any man a king in Rome again. Thus the Romans swore never again to suffer a king. But they did not abolish concentrated power. Instead, they clothed it with new garments: 2 consuls in place of a king, a senate in place of aristocrats and royal advisers, and a dictator in times of crisis. This system, which the Enlightenment thinkers hailed as a model of liberty, was in truth riddled with contradictions. The Roman Republic was not the opposite of a monarchy, but a reshuffling of power which just often led to an oligarchy. Checking the parts of the Republic mentioned earlier, we should start with the 2 consuls. They were elected annually, they shared power, commanded the army, and checked each other's authority. Most of the time, they struggled to agree, meaning a lot of issues were delayed for the next guys in office to take care of. Or they were sent to the Senate, which gave the Senate a lot of power. As unlike monarchs, who ruled for life, consuls ruled for only a year, and they struggled to get much done in that time, as they spent most of it fighting each other. The Senate, also known as the advisory body, was made up of former magistrates, mostly aristocrats. Though it was supposed to be namely advisory, in practice it held a lot of influence over policy, foreign affairs, and finance. The Senate voted in consuls, and the senators were voted in by magistrates. The magistrates were voted in by the people. They functioned similarly to the representatives of the USA who vote in the president. However, just like politicians of the modern era, they fell to bribes and lobbying by the candidates they voted for, meaning the power scaled into the hands of the wealthy and the nobility instead of the people. Offices had term limits, collegially 2 or more magistrates holding the same office, and accountability after the office, again, was only on paper. As mentioned earlier, bribery was common amongst magistrates, and that the council often had to pass issues to the Senate because they struggled to agree on issues, which gave the Senate a lot more power. So when bribery was taken to the Senate, what would often happen is that the Senate would bribe potential consul candidates, which broke the power balance and shifted it back to the Senate. So instead of the power balance being from a hierarchical position of power, it was often held between people of similar status trying to placate one another with money, meaning the wealthy in the Senate often pushed issues that favored themselves. Other senators who weren't as wealthy or as charismatic often hired assassins to ensure their policies would go through in order to favor themselves. Tiberius Gracchus was beaten to death with wooden benches by senators who opposed his land reform. For example, his later brother Gaius suffered a similar fate. Led to laws and reforms being passed only for personal gain and constant infighting wherever interests clashed. In practice, the government was not serving the people. Consuls couldn't pass any meaningful reforms even if they wanted to because they risked getting killed by senators, deadlocked by their colleagues, or simply outbid with bribes. Real power rested in the Senate, and the Senate rarely passed reforms for the community, only for themselves. The problem worsened as Rome expanded. Magistrates in conquered territories who were supposed to represent the local people were routinely bribed and replaced by Senate loyalists. The money that should have been developed in those provinces instead went to the pockets of the Roman aristocracy. This created a massive wealth inequality, and when wealth inequality is in turn, it breeds stability. Enlightenment thinkers would often portray this slow corruption as an otherwise good system, but in reality these flaws were present from the very beginning. They were only left to fester. So to recap, a weak executive locked in constant infighting, a bloated Senate hoarding the power and the wealth, and representatives corrupted by bribery, and a populace growing even poorer. Then a man, from the ranks of a general, he saw the wealth inequality poisoning the Republic, and conquered the Senate with only 600 men. Once in power, he purged many senators and filled their seats with loyal supporters. Those senators then granted him the powers of dictator, and eventually emperor from life. This man was Julius Caesar. Caesar concentrated power into the executive, corrected systematic flaws, and achieved reforms the Republic had stalled for centuries, all within one lifetime. He redistributed land and wealth to the poor, strengthened the executive, and curbed the Senate's reckless spending. By Aristotle's definition, he looked every way like the virtuous king, a man standing up for the people. To quote Julius Caesar himself, "I am defending my own dignity, that of the Roman people, and the tribunes of the plebs, who have been most outrageously driven out of the city." But such a man of virtue offended the Roman elites. Remember, Caesar only replaced some of the Senate, not all of them. Those who remained resented his reforms and the loss of their privileges. For this treachery, they stabbed him 55 times on the Senate floor. But this centralization led to Rome slowly becoming a monarchy, as more and more relatives and very close officials, who were family, not by blood, of Caesar, took the throne. The Roman Republic, once again, reformed back into a monarchy, but with new titles. Contrary to what Whig historians often claim, kings in the medieval era did not wield absolute power. In fact, they were often the weakest players in the political order, forced to share authority with the nobility and the clergy. The clergy in particular held a divine checkmate over monarchs. Each king needed recognition from the papacy to be considered legitimate. There was no "I rule because I'm a Castilian." Rather, kings ruled because the Pope sanctioned them. Without papal approval, a monarch could be branded illegitimate, which in turn could spark unrest among the people and give nobles justification to overthrow them. Thus kings had to constantly placate the church, granting it land and privileges, and in return for legitimacy. The nobility, meanwhile, held the king's military power within their own hands. As feudal lords, they commanded knights and levies, making them essential for defense, but also dangerous rivals. The king depended on keeping them loyal, which often meant granting them land, rights, and exemptions that further weakened royal authority. Even the common folk held a degree of leverage. They held the ability to petition the king and vote in assemblies. Spain, for example, had El Cortes, assemblies where the peasantry and the nobility got together to petition and bring issues towards the king. El Cortes de Leon, for example, was considered Europe's first parliament with popular representation. If the king didn't at least acknowledge these demands, the clergy and the king wouldn't get their taxes, because tax withholds were a common method of protest. In times of famine and plague and or oppression, peasants could revolt against their lords and destabilize whole regions, sometimes even topple kings. This meant monarchs had to pay attention to crop harvests, taxes, and local conditions, at least insofar as nobles and clergy would allow reforms that benefited the people. In practice, whether a king passed laws or made major decisions, he had to do so with the consent, or at least the acquiescence, of the nobility, the clergy, and the people. Far from the picture of absolute monarchy later writers imagined, medieval kingship was a delicate balancing act, constantly negotiating between rival centers of power. The picture I painted for you at the start of the video was just another lie by Whig historians, as you might imagine. They like to ignore everything I just said and cherry-pick details from other periods as proof of oppression, then apply it to the Middle Ages. They like to portray that the king is entirely absolute and was the cause of famine in the Middle Ages. They exploited the nobles to take advantage of their lands. This was never the case here. Everything portrayed at the beginning was contrary to reality, and is everything you don't want to do as a leader. Before we continue, I feel that we cannot talk about the Middle Ages without talking about the Islamic world, which evolved very differently compared to the rest of Europe, but first you should know some terms. A caliph is the successor to the Rashidun Caliph, the caliphate of the Prophet. A sultan is just a standard king for the most part. They controlled the military and political power and often worked with the caliph and drew legitimacy from him. Almost like a pope-king dynamic like the one I mentioned earlier. Sharia being Islamic law, and nowadays it just takes care of family matters, inheritance, and contracts between Muslims. During the early Islamic age, most of military levy composition was of slaves, such as the Mamluks or Ghilman, who would often fight in war for their freedom. These people could be enslaved for any number of reasons, such as being POWs, criminals, just some random tribe, etc. Any reason you could think of. The whole idea is that they'd get to fight to earn their freedom, or they could pursue a military career and get land from it, meaning there was a lot of social mobility even if you were at the bottom of the caste. Europe had a very similar levy system, however. It was mostly comprised of serfs rather than slaves, with feudal contracts to their lord. And since the Islamic world never had a feudal system, they relied on slaves, which brings me to the next topic of the Islamic world. Instead of feudalism, the Islamic world relied on a clan system. Certain families or clans controlled particular regions and sectors of the Sultanate, holding lands and raising armies. These powerful clans would often gain influence at the court and could become emirs, the nobility of the Islamic world. Emirs controlled provinces on behalf of the Sultan, but there were a few key differences from how the European feudal nobility and the emir system worked. Social mobility was a key difference between how the nobility of Europe and the nobility of the Islamic world worked. Emirs could come from anywhere, even from slavery, as it was to a degree meritocratic. Figures like Badr al-Jamali, who began life as an Armenian slave before becoming the de facto ruler of Egypt. Another difference was land ownership and state authority. Emirs held land, but the ultimate control still belonged to the state. Another difference would be the Iqta system. Instead of hereditary rights, emirs were compensated with revenue grants, also known as Iqta, essentially a paycheck drawn from taxes, which tied their authority more directly to the Sultan rather than making them semi-independent lords. A major exception to this pattern in the Islamic world is Al-Andalus, which had a kind of hybrid system combining elements of the Islamic clan structure with aspects of the European-style feudalism. Al-Andalus was massively different merely because, like in Europe, they were constantly being invaded all the time, so clans became progressively more like vassals, like in Europe, with more and more power. So even in the Middle East, the idea of oppression and the king stomping on the lower classes is just nothing but a myth. So to recap, medieval kings were at the mercy of the peasantry, the nobility and the clergy, and the kings of the Islamic world were not feudal, as some might think, but had their own system that also was as oppressive as people might think. So, what gives? Where do all these misconceptions about medieval government comes from? To understand why Whig history and liberalism was conceived, we must understand the age of absolutism, and how liberalism was just a reaction to the age of absolutism. The name itself is a bit misleading, as nobility and clergy still had a lot of power over the king. It's just now that the king had more power over the nation than the two ruling classes. This was because of a few reasons. By the 1400s, the constant invasions from the steppe, the Islamic world, and the north had largely came to an end. The feudal system, originally designed to respond to these local threats, through noble-controlled armies and contracts, became less necessary. Instead, it only slowed down government functions. Powerful lords posed a direct danger to the stability of kingdoms, and noble with too much power and too many troops could overthrow the monarch, or plunge the realm into succession wars, as seen by the War of the Roses. From the 1400s onwards, monarchs spent nearly 2 centuries chipping away noble autonomy and limiting their ability to raise private armies, buying out or dissolving their feudal rights, and centralizing authority in the crown. Many contracts reduced the number of troops a lord could keep and gave the central government more direct control over local administration. The final reason was military innovation and infrastructure innovation. Improved infrastructure further weakened the rationale for decentralization. Professional standing armies replaced levies, and advances in fortifications, weaponry, and logistics gave the monarchs more reliable control over their forces. Meanwhile, better maintained roads and communication networks allowed armies and royal messengers to travel more efficiently across long distances, reducing the need to rely on semi-independent lords to maintain regions. Because of these reasons, and many more minor reasons, the central government tried to transform the feudal system into a unitary or federal system. This was met with extreme backlash in many kingdoms, so a workaround was conceived. It's okay to revoke people's lands if they're a criminal. Upon their ascension, Los Reyes Catolicos, Ferdinand and Isabella, faced a fractured realm where the Aragonese and Castilian nobility, empowered by the civil wars of the 1400s, had built many unauthorized castles and raised private armies. The monarchs ordered hundreds of these illegal castles to be destroyed and restricted the size of the noble retinues as consequence. They revived the Santa Hermandad in 1476, a crown-funded national militia that patrolled the countryside and enforced royal justice, and it took over many of the functions that were performed by the local lords' armies prior. Alongside their military reforms, the monarchy elevated a new administrative class of letrados, university-trained legal professionals of modest origin, whose careers and loyalty depended entirely on the crown. Typically, they were drawn from urban middle classes, including merchant families and lower clergy. Letrados occasionally also included unlanded nobles as well. Anyone can easily become a letrado, if they had the funds to do so. By converting the legal expertise into a royal service, they opened a pathway for commoners to enter the government and wield meaningful authority over their lives. Their duties ranged widely, however. They served as royal judges, governors, counselors, tax officials, and even viceroys in the Americas, all salaried directly by the crown. In this way, the rise of the letrados placed a traditional noble privilege with a professional bureaucracy. That not only strengthened royal centralization, but also made it so that way a common man could have power in their own country. Los Reyes Católicos also reorganized El Caneso Real, which gave greater weight to professional jurists in the new letrado class, while also recruiting nobles who willingly sided away their privileges as compensation. They also installed corregidores in towns and royal governors who supervised municipal councils and prevented local elites from monopolizing their authority. Finally, noble privilege to dispense their personal justice in their domains was weakened, as appeals could now be taken to royal courts. El Coneso Real and El Corregidores made it very easy for social mobility for the average commoner, as long as they could become a letrado. Through these measures, Los Reyes Católicos broke feudalism, centralizing authority in the crown and laying the foundation for Spanish absolutism. In 1516, El Rey Carlos ascended to the throne of Spain. Born in Flanders, he could not speak any Castilian and surrounded himself with Flemish courtiers. His election as Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, funded by heavy taxation in Castile and massive loans from the German and Italian bankers, only deepened resentment. To many Spaniards, he appeared to be a foreign king who cared for foreign affairs than his own people. This discontent erupted in the Comuneros Revolt of 1520, led by an alliance of townsmen, lower clergy, and segments of the lesser nobility, who demanded a more national monarchy free of foreign advisors, limits on taxation and money leaving the kingdom, and a strong role for El Cortes. Yet Carlos crushed the revolt in the Battle of Villalar in 1521. The grandees, fearing the radical turn of the revolt, had abandoned the revolt, giving Carlos opportunity to restore his authority. After the victory, he executed rebel leaders such as Juan de Pailla, Juan Bravo, and Francisco Maldonado, but balanced this with pardons for many of his supporters to prevent future unrest. Carlos then used this revolt to weaken the very groups that had opposed him. He abolished the private armies of the nobles, curtailed the power of the Cortes, and built a centralized bureaucracy staffed by letrados. In doing so, he continued the centralizing policies of Ferdinand and Isabella, turning the rebellion into an opportunity for reform, which made it even easier for commoners to get social mobility. This pattern was not unique to Spain, but as a broader European trend. Across the continent, monarchs took advantage of civil strife or noble weakness to consolidate power. King Henry VII of England broke the power of the barons after the War of the Roses. Louis XI of France dismantled the independence of the powerful dukes, and by the 17th century, Louis XIV would take this logic to the extreme by famously declaring "L'État c'est moi," I am the state, though he never actually said that. Louis XIV's France became a model for European absolutism as he reduced the power of the nobility by forcing them to live under his watchful eye at Versailles, turning once powerful lords into courtiers dependent on royal favor. He expanded the system of intendant, royal officials from the bourgeoisie who administrated provinces, collected taxes, and enforced royal law by bypassing noble authority. He also centralized justice and finance in Paris, expanding a professional standing army loyal to the crown, and integrated the Catholic Church into royal policy through the Galician system. By stripping away regional autonomy and monopolizing patronage, Louis XIV ensured that all roads of power led directly to the monarch. His reign represented a culmination of a long medieval to modern process. Kings who once balanced between the nobility, the clergy, and the commoners now stood above them all as a single source of authority. When people are asked who the greatest kings of their nations were, they often name rulers of the age of absolutism. The reason is simple. These monarchs possessed enough power to stabilize their realms and end cycles of civil strife, and to implement sweeping reforms when they were most urgently needed, rather than waiting years for fractious nobles to unite or feuding factions to resolve disputes, seen as in the War of the Roses in England or the Castilian Civil War under Enrique IV of Castilla. Absolute rulers like Louis XIV, Felipe el Segundo, or los Reyes Católicos could act decisively and restore order through central authority. Yet, it is a grave mistake to assume that the absolute kings were truly unchecked. In practice, even the most powerful monarchs of the period faced numerous restraints, like Louis XIV, again, the man who famously claimed, "L'été c'est moi," was still bound by law, tradition, and immense influence of regional parliaments, and nobles who resisted his decrees. In Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella curbed noble power through the Santa Hermandad and by reducing the autonomy of the great houses, but they still had to rely on the Cortes to approve taxation. Felipe el Segundo, despite his global empire, faced constant negotiation with Castilian and Aragonese assemblies, whose fiscal privileges and regional laws that were not easy to override. Even in England, monarchs such as James I, Charles I, Charles II, all cooperated with Parliament before having to resort to royal prerogative. The truth is that the age of absolutism was not one of unbound despotism. It was a period in which kings, hemmed in law, faith, and powerful estates, sought to impose unity in societies fractured by feudal inheritance and civil war. Their centralization was not a symptom of tyranny, but a desperate act to preserve society. When the Enlightenment arrived, many of the so-called absolutist kings adopted Enlightenment principles themselves. Ideas such as free speech, freedom of assembly, limitations of torture, and judicial reform favoring social mobility, the monarchs during the age of absolutism had done prior, such as Frederick the Great of Prussia, Joseph II of Austria, and even Spain's Carlos el III, styled themselves as enlightened despots, delivering that reason and progress could strengthen rather than weaken the state. Of course, there were exceptions. In France and Russia, royal governments maintained extensive censorship and surveillance, often through secret police who monitored and suppressed radical thinkers such as the Jacobins, the Freemasons, and the Illuminati. Ironically, however, these were later implemented by the same liberal societies that claimed to overthrow absolutism. Britain, for instance, would often censor the quote-unquote radical right in media, and monitor political societies throughout the 20th and 21st century, or even some EU nations like Germany or Denmark which have done the same. But that is a discussion for another video. I am sorry for the longer delays in this video. It's been a mixture of procrastination, having to rewrite this script a few times, because originally I had an idea where I'd talk about the evolution of monarchism, but that just proved to just be, too much, and it would just extend the length of the video unnecessarily instead of tackling the key points of historical misconception. I am always welcome to criticism and fact-checking, but that is all I have for the day. I am Erosión, and I would like to thank you for paying me some mind.